In the Dakota Territory of 1883, the sight was strange enough to make a man pull up his horse. On a windswept rise overlooking the half-frozen mud river, an Inuit man named Kaelen was cutting blocks of snow, not clearing it, cutting it, with a long knife made from a sharpened wagon spring. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm that ignored the biting November wind. To the settlers riding past, it looked like a fool's errand. They saw a man building a house out of the very thing that was trying to kill them. They saw insanity. They saw a man who had lost his mind to the vast, empty prairie. They muttered to themselves, shook their heads, and rode on, hurrying toward the wood smoke and solid timber of their own cabins. They believed in log walls, chinked with mud and moss. They believed in the roar of a cast-iron stove. They didn't believe in houses made of winter. And when the winter of 1883 hit, a season later dubbed the Winter of the White Death, that crazy house of snow would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would prove that everything the settlers thought they knew about staying warm was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. If you want to see the number that made the territory's most experienced builders go silent, the number that changed everything, stay until the end. What did this quiet man from the north understand about heat, wind, and snow that every seasoned frontiersman in the valley had missed? If this is your first time here, subscribe for more stories of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Kaelen wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old hunter trying to keep his family alive. He and his wife, unhurried, weren't from this land of grass and distant horizons. They were from the true north, a world of sea ice and stone. They had journeyed south 2 years prior, following the advice of a traveling doctor who said the drier, warmer climate might help unhurried's persistent lung sickness. They had settled on a small parcel of land nobody else wanted, a windswept patch near the river, and built a small cabin just as their neighbors had. By frontier standards, it was respectable. Cottonwood logs, squared by hand, a stone fireplace that drew well enough, a sod roof. They had done everything they were told to do, and their first winter had been a lesson in brutal, unending misery. That first year, Kaelen burned through 6 cords of wood. He spent most of his days felling, hauling, and splitting timber, a resource that was scarce on the open plains. The work left him exhausted, with little time for trapping, the very thing that was supposed to earn them their living. The cabin was a sieve for heat. Wind drove through the chinking like invisible needles. Frost grew in crystalline ferns on the inside of the walls. His 2 young daughters, Nuna and Sila, slept in their coats and fur blankets, huddled together. Unhurried's cough grew worse in the damp, drafty air. She spent her evenings stuffing rags along the baseboards, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. The temperature inside rarely climbed above 40 degrees, even with the stove glowing red hot. The family lived in a small bubble of warmth right next to the fire, while the rest of the cabin remained locked in a deep, penetrating chill. Kaelen was a quiet, observant man. He had spent his life reading the language of ice and weather, and as that first winter ground on, he started to see the problem differently than his neighbors. They saw the cold as an enemy to be fought with fire. Bigger fires, more wood, hotter stoves. Kaelen saw the wind as the true thief. He watched how it scoured the heat from the windward side of his cabin. Wind doesn't just chill air, it strips heat directly from solid surfaces through a process called convection. A 20-mile-per-hour wind could pull heat from a log wall 30 times faster than still air. The settlers were essentially trying to heat the entire Dakota Territory. One evening, watching Anuri shiver by the fire, the memory of his grandfather came to him. He remembered the hunting shelters they would build on the sea ice, structures that could hold comfortable warmth from a single seal oil lamp, even as a blizzard raged outside. The settlers saw snow as a cold, wet nuisance to be shoveled away. His people understood its true nature. Dry, compacted snow is mostly trapped air, and trapped air is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. His plan formed, simple and absolute. He would not fight the winter, he would use it. He would build a shelter, not of wood, which conducted the cold, but of the cold itself. He would build an igloo. He waited for the right conditions. Not just any snow would do. It needed to be deep, at least 4 feet, and compacted by the wind into a firm, consistent drift. He found the perfect spot in mid-November, a long, deep drift that had formed on the leeward side of the riverbank. The raw material had been delivered and prepared by the very wind he sought to defeat. He began the work with a long, thin blade he'd fashioned. The settlers saw a knife. Kaelen saw a panna, a snow knife. He cut the first trench deep into the drift. This trench would become the lower sunken entrance of the shelter, a critical design element. Then he began cutting the blocks. Each one was about 3 feet long, 20 inches high, and 8 inches thick. He didn't lift them out. He slid them, keeping his movements efficient, preserving energy. As he worked, he was applying principles of physics his ancestors had perfected over 1,000 years. The blocks weren't square. They were slightly tapered, allowing them to lean inward and form a curve. He laid the first course of blocks around the edge of a circle about 12 feet in diameter. Then he did something that looked strange. He cut a sloping ramp into that first layer. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. From this point on, he would cut the blocks for the wall from the floor of the igloo itself, working his way down as the walls worked their way up. This meant he never had to lift a heavy block over the wall. He was always working at a comfortable height, in a continuous, inward spiraling ramp. The structure rose around him, a self-supporting dome. Each new block was braced by the one below it and the one beside it. The shape wasn't a simple hemisphere. It was a catenary curve, the same shape a heavy chain makes when hung between 2 points. This is one of the strongest self-supporting arches in nature. It distributed the weight of the snow perfectly, eliminating any single point of stress. Anuri brought him hot tea, her face etched with worry. "Kaelen, the trader's wife. She asked if we were well. She said people are talking." "Let them talk," he said, not pausing in his work. "Talking doesn't keep the children warm." He worked for 2 days. The walls spiraled up and in until only a small hole remained at the very top. He cut a final, carefully shaped keystone block and fitted it into place from the outside, locking the entire structure together. From the outside, it was a smooth, silent white dome on the prairie, a feature that seemed more grown than built. But the work wasn't finished. The genius of the design was in the details. He used his knife to smooth the interior joints, then brought a lamp inside. The slight heat from the lamp melted the very inner surface of the blocks. When the lamp was removed, this thin layer of moisture refroze, turning the entire dome into a single monolithic shell of solid, airtight ice-welded snow. He then built the entrance tunnel. It was low, forcing anyone who entered to crawl. Crucially, the floor of the tunnel was lower than the main floor of the igloo. This created a natural cold trap. Cold air is heavier than warm air. Any cold air that got into the tunnel would simply pool at the bottom, unable to rise up into the living space. The family's own body heat and the warmth from their lamp would create a pool of warm air that literally floated on top of the cold, unable to escape through the entrance. It's the same principle as a P-trap in modern plumbing. Inside, he built a wide sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the floor. This got them up into the warmest layer of air, well above the cold trap. He carved shelves into the walls for their few belongings, and at the very top of the dome, he poked a small, fist-sized ventilation hole. This was essential. It allowed carbon dioxide and water vapor from their breath to escape, ensuring the air stayed fresh and, importantly, dry. Without it, the moisture would condense and freeze on the walls, ruining the snow's insulating properties. The final touch was a clear block of freshwater ice he'd cut from the river. He set it into the wall like a window, and it filled the interior with a soft, diffused light. From the outside, it looked like a burial mound made of snow. The total cost was zero. The materials were free. The only investment was his time and a knowledge passed down through generations. When Unhurried and the girls came to see it, they crawled through the low tunnel and stood up inside. The wind, which had been a constant, howling presence for weeks, was gone. The silence was absolute. The light from the ice window gave the space a calm, ethereal glow. It wasn't just a shelter. It felt safe. Unhurried ran her hand along the smooth, hard inner wall. "Kaelen," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and fear. "People are going to think we've lost our minds." "Let them," he said, his voice level. "We will be warm." And when the neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw desperation. They saw a family so poor they had to live in a snowbank. The ridicule started before the first snow of the real winter even fell. The first to visit was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood ran the small sawmill in the valley and had built, by his own count, half the cabins in a 50-mile radius. He was a man who understood timber. He saw himself as an authority, a pillar of the small community. He rode up to Kaelen's abandoned cabin, saw it was empty, and followed the tracks to the dome of snow. Kaelen was outside, organizing his traps. Blackwood dismounted, his face a mask of professional concern. He walked around the igloo, poking it with a gloved finger. "Son," he said, not unkindly, "I don't know what they do up where you're from, but this won't work here. The sun in this territory is strong, even in winter. This thing will melt on the first clear day. Worse, your own body heat will turn the inside to slush. You'll wake up in a puddle, if you wake up at all. It's a snow coffin, is what it is." He was applying his own logic, the logic of a world where things that got wet stayed wet. He didn't understand that the immense cold of the snow block itself would act as a heat sink, wicking away the moisture from the inner surface and allowing it to refreeze, strengthening the structure. He didn't understand that the temperature inside would stabilize just above freezing, a perfect equilibrium. Kaelen simply nodded. "We will see, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. "I've got some scrap lumber down at the mill. You come see me when you're ready to build a real shelter for that wife of yours." The public mockery was less polite. It came a week later at the trading post. Kaelen was trading a few muskrat pelts for flour and salt. Jedediah Vance, a big, loud man with a thick beard and a crueler sense of humor, saw him come in. In a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, Vance boomed, "Well, look what the blizzard dragged in. Heard you built yourself a new place, Kaelen. Tell me, do you have to ask the snow for permission before you light a fire?" A few men chuckled nervously. The insult hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. Kaelen didn't rise to the bait. He finished his trade, gave a slight nod to the trader, and walked out. His quiet dignity only seemed to infuriate men like Vance more. The nickname stuck. To many in the valley, he was no longer Kaelen. He was the snowman. The gossip spread through the usual channels. Men talked at the trading post. Women whispered at the small church gatherings. Neighbors would change their route just to ride past his homestead, pointing at the strange white dome. They didn't see a home. They saw an object of curiosity, a symbol of his strangeness, his otherness. The pressure fell heaviest on Inuri. At a quilting circle, the other wives would fall silent when she entered the room. One woman, meaning to be kind, pulled her aside. "Dear," she said, her voice dripping with pity, "if you and the children need a warm place to stay, our door is always open. You needn't suffer on account of a man's pride." The assumption was that Kaelen was either too proud or too ignorant to provide a proper home. Inuri thanked her and left early, her cheeks burning. The official concern came from Mr. Hayes, the territorial land agent. He arrived on horseback, a ledger book under his arm. He was a man who lived by rules and regulations. "Kaelen," he began without dismounting, "your claim requires you to make improvements, a permanent dwelling. This structure," he gestured at the igloo, "this isn't in any manual I've seen. This won't count toward proving up your homestead." "It is warmer than my cabin," Kaelen stated simply. "That's not the point," Hayes said, frustrated. "The point is permanence. The point is standards. You have until spring to erect a suitable log or sod dwelling." He made a note in his book and rode off. But the cut that went deepest came from family. Inuri's younger brother Taktu had come south with them. He had taken to the settlers' ways with enthusiasm. He worked for Silas Blackwood at the sawmill, wore denim trousers, and was saving up to buy his own parcel of land. He came to visit, his face clouded with worry. He refused to go inside the igloo, standing out in the wind. "Sister," he said to Inuri, ignoring Kaelen, "this is not our way anymore. We are in their land now. We must live as they do." He turned to Kaelen. "People talk. They think you don't know how to build a proper house with an axe and saw. They think you're either scared of the work or incompetent. Maybe both. They feel sorry for your family." "Their pity doesn't chop wood," Kaelen replied, his voice flat. "It is a matter of respect," Taktu insisted. "You are making us look like savages." Kaelen finally looked his brother-in-law in the eye. "I am not trying to impress anyone. I am trying to keep my family warm." By early December, not one person in the Mud River Valley thought Kaelen had solved anything. They thought he had built a monument to his own foolishness, a temporary tomb of ice. They watched and waited for the prairie winter to teach him the lesson they were all so sure he needed to learn. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Kaelen right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1883 to 84 is still recorded in state climatology archives as one of the most severe in the 20th century. It began not with a storm, but with a silent, lethal plunge of the thermometer. December 8th, the overnight low was minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The settlers just threw another log on the fire. December 12th, it dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind picked up, a steady, razor-sharp gale out of the north. December 18th, the sky turned a strange, hazy gray. The temperature sank to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills plummeting below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the snow began. It wasn't a gentle flurry. It was a horizontal blizzard, a roaring wall of white that erased the world. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never climbed above zero. The blizzard raged for 3 days straight, piling snow into drifts 20 feet high. It buried fences, sheds, and entire wagons, and for the settlers in their proper log cabins, life became a desperate losing battle. The community suffering was immediate and specific. Silas Blackwood, the master builder, had one of the tightest-built cabins in the valley. He was burning through his massive wood pile at a staggering rate, nearly 2 cords a month. Still, he couldn't get the temperature inside his home above 42 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife and children lived in a constant state of shivering. The Vance family, who lived downriver, were in worse shape. Jedediah had been careless with his wood supply. By Christmas, they were running out. They started burning fence posts, then a broken wagon wheel, then the furniture from their spare room. Their cabin, poorly chinked, held a constant, miserable 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Their youngest son came down with pneumonia. Across the valley, the story was the same. Families were burning half a cord of wood a week just to stay above freezing. The green, unseasoned cottonwood many had been forced to cut produced more smoke than heat, clogging chimneys with creosote. More than one cabin fire started that winter. Livestock, left in uninsulated barns, froze to death where they stood. People woke up to find their water buckets frozen solid, inches from the stove. It was a cold that found its way through every crack, a cold that felt personal, malevolent. And then, through the lulls in the wind, people started noticing the Kaelen place, or rather, they noticed the lack of anything to notice. While every other chimney in the valley belched a constant, thick plume of desperate smoke, the air above Kaelen's snow dome was almost always clear. A tiny, pencil-thin wisp of vapor would occasionally rise from the ventilation hole, but that was it. On one of the few clear, brutally cold afternoons, a neighbor riding out to check his cattle traps saw an impossible sight. Kaelen, outside his igloo, in his shirt sleeves. He was calmly scraping a hide, the movements as unhurried as they had been in November. The neighbor was so stunned he nearly fell off his horse. He rode back to the trading post, and the story spread like wildfire. How could a man be comfortable outside in this cold? What was happening inside that house of snow? The whispers of mockery turned into whispers of disbelief, and then of grudging curiosity. If you're still here, stay with me, because the number that came out of this shelter didn't just surprise the valley. It defied their entire understanding of the world. The vindication began on December 23rd. Silas Blackwood was making an emergency run. The Vance family had sent their oldest boy for help, saying their fire was nearly out and the baby was sick. Blackwood loaded his sleigh with a quarter cord of his own precious seasoned oak, a desperate act of charity. His route took him past Kaelen's homestead. On impulse, driven by a gnawing curiosity he couldn't explain, he pulled his horse to a stop. He expected to find a family on the brink of freezing and had a few logs ready to offer them too. He walked through the deep snow to the low entrance of the igloo. He called out Kaelen's name. The skin flap over the entrance pushed aside, and Anuri's face appeared. She looked fine, not just surviving. Her cheeks were full, her eyes were clear. She wasn't bundled in furs. She was wearing a simple cloth dress over her sealskin tunic. The warmth that flowed out of the low entrance hit him first. It was a gentle, steady warmth, not the scorching, dry heat of a stove, but a humid, living warmth. It hit him like stepping from January into May. He was so shocked he took a step back. "Is everything all right, Mr. Blackwood?" Anuri asked. Yes," he stammered. "I was checking on neighbors. The Vances are in a bad way. Do you need any wood?" "No," she said politely. "We are fine, thank you. We are managing fine." Behind her, through the opening, Blackwood saw the impossible. He saw Kaelen's two little girls sitting on the raised platform at a small wooden table. They were playing with their dolls. They were in simple cotton dresses, not coats, not blankets, dresses. Blackwood stared, unable to process the scene. His own children hadn't taken off their wool coats in 2 weeks. "How?" he started, then stopped. "How much fuel are you burning?" It was the only question that made sense to a man like him. "Just the lamp, mostly," Anuri said. "We use the stove only for a little while to cook." Blackwood knew Kaelen had a tiny sheet metal stove, barely bigger than a bucket, but he'd seen no smoke. And the lamp, it was a traditional quillick, a shallow stone dish that burned seal or buffalo tallow. It gave off about as much heat as a few large candles. It was impossible. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of a new, desperate respect, Could I come in for a moment?" Anuri nodded and held the flap open. Blackwood got on his hands and knees and crawled through the low, dark tunnel. As he emerged into the main chamber, the feeling of warmth enveloped him. The air was still and silent. The light from the ice window was soft on the eyes. He stood up and looked around. On a small shelf carved into the snow wall sat a cheap thermometer from the trading post. Blackwood walked over to it, his boots silent on the caribou skin floor covering. The mercury sat clearly and steadily at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. 65 degrees. Blackwood stared at the number, his mind refusing to accept it. He looked back at the thermometer in his own cabin in his mind's eye. It read 40 on a good day. Outside this dome of snow, the temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of 105 degrees. He reached out and touched the wall. It wasn't wet or slushy. It was hard, dry, and cold to the touch, like the inside of an icebox. Yet the air just inches away was warm. He couldn't understand it. He was a man who built things, who understood heat and wood and stone. This defied every rule he knew. Kaelen, who had been quietly watching him, spoke. "The snow holds the heat we make. The wood in your cabin, it holds the cold from outside." The simple truth of it struck Blackwood with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his life building houses that fought the cold and lost. This man had built a house that cooperated with it. He thought about the fuel. His own home, at 42 degrees, was consuming nearly a cord of wood every 2 weeks. The Colby Ranch, even bigger, was burning 2 cords a month and barely staying alive. William's place, a small cabin like Kaelen's old one, was going through 1.8 cords a month just to keep the inside at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Kaelen's Igloo, holding a comfortable 65 degrees, was being heated by a single stone lamp that consumed maybe a gallon of tallow a week. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. It was the difference between a bucket and a sieve. Blackwood slowly turned and looked at Kaelen. He looked at the warm, healthy children playing in their dresses. He thought of his own family, huddled in blankets around a roaring stove in a 40-degree room. He thought of Jedediah Vance's sick baby. He felt a sense of shame so profound it almost buckled his knees. All his experience, all his pride, all his community standing, it was all built on a foundation of ignorance. He looked at Kaelen, the man they had all pitied and mocked. He opened his mouth, and the only words that came out were raw and honest. "We've been doing this wrong," he said, his voice thick. "For 50 years, we've been doing this all wrong." The real vindication wasn't just in the number on the thermometer. It was in the human dignity the structure provided. Nuna and Scylla did their schoolwork without shivering. Anuri cooked and mended in comfort, her cough finally beginning to fade in the clean, dry air. They slept soundly through the night, not waking every few hours to a freezing room and the desperate need to feed the stove. Kaelen's system had turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. Word of Blackwood's visit spread through the valley like a thaw. It was one thing to hear a rumor from a passing neighbor. It was another to hear it from Silas Blackwood, the man who built their homes. The mockery died overnight, replaced by a stunned, humbled silence. After the blizzard broke, Mr. Hayes, the land agent, made his way to the homestead, this time with a calibrated government thermometer. He was a man of data, and he didn't believe the stories. He conducted his own measurements. The outside air temperature was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. He placed his instrument inside the igloo, waited 20 minutes, and recorded the reading, 66.4 degrees Fahrenheit, an 88-degree differential. He checked Kaelen's meticulous log of tallow consumption. The efficiency numbers were, by his calculations, an order of magnitude greater than the most efficient wood stove. He wrote it all down in his ledger, his handwriting tight with disbelief. This wasn't just a dwelling. It was a piece of thermal engineering so perfect it bordered on miraculous. By the time the great cold snap broke in mid-January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening on the Kaelen homestead. The questions had changed from, "Is he crazy?" to, "How did he do it?" The first convert was a man named Thomas Miller. His family's situation was desperate. His cabin was in a low-lying area, and the blizzard had buried it in a 15-foot drift, blocking his door and chimney. For 2 days they lived in cold and darkness. When he finally tunneled out, his wood was wet, and his family was sick. He swallowed his pride and went to Kaelen. He didn't ask for wood. He asked for knowledge. Kaelen didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply walked with Miller back to the massive drift, engulfing his cabin. He showed him how to tunnel into the snowbank, how to hollow out a small chamber, how to ensure ventilation. It wasn't an igloo, but a simpler shelter called a quingy. Within 3 hours, Miller had moved his shivering wife and children into the snow cave. It was small and cramped, but with a single lantern, it was 50 degrees warmer than their icebox cabin. The shelter saved their lives. That spring, the igloo did melt, just as Blackwood had predicted. But it had served its purpose. Kaelen and unhurried moved back into their log cabin for the summer. But things had changed. That summer, 7 families, with Kaelen's quiet guidance and Blackwood's enthusiastic help, built their new cabins differently. They built them into the south-facing sides of hills, using the earth as insulation. They banked the walls high with sod. They learned from Kaelen's principles. By the following winter, 19 families in the valley had adopted some version of his method, using snow as an insulator instead of fighting it as an enemy. Fuel consumption in the valley dropped by an estimated 40%. Mr. Hayes, the land agent, sent a detailed report back to the territorial government. It included Kaelen's temperature logs, his own verified measurements, and diagrams of the igloo's construction. A bulletin was eventually published and distributed to new homesteaders, containing a chapter on emergency snow shelters and the insulative properties of packed snow. The knowledge spread. Variations of earth berms and snowbanked homes began to appear across the Dakotas and Montana. What Kaelen built in 1883 anticipated by nearly a century what modern building scientists would rediscover about thermal envelopes, air tightness, and superinsulation. He wasn't an inventor. He was a practitioner of ancient, proven knowledge. Years later, when a young newspaper reporter asked him about the winter that made him a local legend, Kaelen was typically terse. He looked at the prairie, then back at the reporter. "The snow is not the enemy," he said. "It is a blanket given by the Creator. You only need to know how to pull it over you." His old igloo is long gone, melted back into the earth. But the principle he reintroduced to that small corner of the world, the idea that wisdom can be quieter and more powerful than brute force, endures. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition. It rewarded what worked. And in the coldest winter of a generation, what worked was a silent, graceful dome of snow. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of survival techniques. The specific characters, names, and locations are fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the engineering and scientific principles demonstrated are based on real historical and indigenous practices.